Hello Year 10. This is the first in a series of videos I hope to post about our topic of migration during this time whilst we can't be in school. And we just covered the British expansion into Africa, looking at Cecil Rhodes and the Boer War, but I want to take us back to a period that starts a little before then, and that looks at the origins of the British Empire in India. To do that, I'm going to start by looking at the East India Company, understanding what this was and how it came to dominate India by 1858. To do this, we will break down the company's involvement in India into three specific periods. Firstly, from 1600 to 1700, when its sole focus was trade; from 1700 to 1757, when a transformation takes place and it starts to take control of India; and finally, from 1757 to 1858, when it set about building an empire for Britain. So, to start with, let's look at that period from 1600, when it was first granted a royal charter by Queen Elizabeth. The company had actually been formed in the previous year, 1599, when approximately 200 businessmen of the City of London joined together to invest their money in a trading company that would target India. Trade with India was not unusual by this point. In fact, even during the Roman era, accounts spoke of the textiles that could be obtained from there. However, the ability to travel such long distances made trading slightly easier by this point, as they could go by sea. Indeed, those 200 businessmen recruited privateers, experienced in the Atlantic trade, to crew their ships. India was targeted because of the desirable products that could be obtained there, especially spices such as pepper, nutmeg and mace. These could be used to flavour puddings, and England was developing a sweet tooth following the imports of sugar from the Americas. Now, in addition to this, Indian textiles would become a key attraction for the company. It was in India that calicos, indigo and silk could be obtained, manufactured products that were of such fine quality that they were in great demand in England and beyond. So, those 200 initial investors in the East India Company recognised that they could make big profits on their investments. This turned out to be true, as from the very start they were making a 250% profit, and this continued to a point where by 1700 the company was making £500,000 a year. Multiply this by 100 for an approximate idea of how much that would be worth today. So, in those first 100 years, after the company's arrival in India, it managed to accelerate the demand for manufactured textile goods. Factories sprung up from Madras to Bengal. Indeed, Bengal was then the workshop of the world, with over 1 million weavers working in the state. And remember, this was 100 years before a city such as Manchester would reach its peak in Britain's Industrial Revolution. Between 1700 and 1757, a change started to take place as the company became increasingly sophisticated as well as profitable. The company went from being a trading company to controlling significant parts of India. One of the reasons for this was the fact that the company recruited Indian soldiers, or sepoys, into its own army. Now remember, this was a private army owned by the East India Company and not the official army of the British government. It became easier to recruit local indigenous soldiers rather than paying British soldiers to travel over from Britain. Now, the best example of this was at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, where Colonel Robert Clive, leader of the company's army, had 750 European soldiers, but over 2,000 Indian soldiers fighting under him. After 1757, the British government started to support the company by supplying them with soldiers and weapons. If you remember our study of America, you will realise that this coincides with Britain's loss of the American colonies. As a result, Professor Linda Colley argues that by 1783, Britain's interest, emotion and lust for empire shifted from North America to the Indian peninsula. Finally, we need to consider the impact the company had on India as it built the empire between 1757 and 1858. The company was largely based around Bengal in the northeast of India, and it started to realise that it needed to govern Bengal in the interests of the Indians as well as its own best interests. However, it did this with the attitude of cultural superiority, in other words, social Darwinism, the belief that as white Europeans they were superior to the Indians. And this is something else we saw when we studied the colonisation of America and the British attitudes towards the Native Americans there, as well as the Africans brought to the Americas as slaves. The company also applied 4 key principles to governing not just India, but its empire generally. Firstly, there was to be no charity, no support to be given to the people. They believed that this just made the people idle. Secondly, they believed that they shouldn't do anything that kept the price of food deliberately low. No interference in the market. Remember, profit was always most important. Thirdly, if the people couldn't grow enough food on the land to feed themselves, then the people would die. That was the attitude of the company. The company would do nothing to interfere with that. And finally, they refused to spend any more money than that which they had budgeted for. Now, the problem here was that in the 1770s and in the years afterwards, a famine hit the state of Bengal and 1/3 of the population died, 1 in 3 people there. The company did nothing to help those people. They simply followed their own rules. No charity, no interference, and no additional money was to be spent. Again, think back to our study of Ireland. An identical attitude was shown there, and approximately 1 million Irish died during their potato famine. Under the leadership of men such as Richard Wellesley, the company increasingly focused on dominating India and spreading their control through other states, often by defeating them in battles. So, why 1858 as the end date for the East India Company? Well, 1857 saw India's first war of independence, an uprising against British control. Now, this was unsuccessful as the British would continue to rule India for the next 100 years. However, it did make the British government question the ability of the company to run India effectively. The following year, 1858, the company had its royal charter withdrawn and India was governed directly. So finally then, what do you need to know about the East India Company? Well, you should make your own notes on the reasons why the company went to India in the first place. What attracted them to the subcontinent? You should also understand how the company transformed from being a group of traders and businessmen to a sophisticated governing organisation with its own huge private army. And finally, you should also be aware of the impact the company had on India and consider what the Indian attitude towards the company would have been. Next time, we'll think about the First War of Independence and its significance in India's fight for independence over the next 100 years. Thanks very much.